Samuel Okafor was 43 years old, and he had always been the one his family called first. He drove a black Suburban with 130,000 miles on it, and a car charger cable that had been fraying at the connector for 3 months, and that he kept meaning to replace. He wore a plain analog watch his grandmother had given him when he graduated college, nothing expensive. A Japanese movement in a steel case, kept clean and running, and he carried a small notebook in his jacket pocket that he had been keeping in some form since his second year of residency. Because he had learned then that the things you don't write down are the things that are disputed later. He was a hospitalist physician, internal medicine, 12 years of practice, the last 7 as department lead at Mercy General, responsible for a floor of complex patients and a team of 8 physicians who relied on him to be the most organized, most even-tempered, most present person in the room at all times. He had always been the one his family called first. When his mother needed a second opinion on her cardiologist's recommendation, she called Samuel. When his younger brother Marcus had a legal situation 3 years ago, Samuel was the one who researched attorneys and drove him to the consultation. When his Aunt Rosie's husband passed and the estate became complicated, it was Samuel who sat with her and read the documents and helped her understand what she was signing. He had been the one they called, until gradually, over the course of 22 months, he wasn't anymore. On a Sunday evening in April, he called his mother to check on her, as he did every Sunday. She did not answer. She had not answered in 6 weeks. He called Marcus. Marcus sent the call to voicemail. He called Aunt Rosie. She picked up, but there was something careful in her voice, a hesitation he recognized as the voice of someone managing information they had decided not to share. He sat in his car in the hospital parking structure, engine running, the fraying charger cable in the cup holder, and understood that something had been done to him in the spaces between the last 22 months. Done deliberately, systematically, and with patience he had not credited to the person responsible. What he also understood, sitting in that parking structure, was that 6 weeks ago he had installed a voice-activated recorder in his home office. He had recorded everything. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. He had installed the recorder on a Wednesday evening in early March, 6 weeks before the Sunday call to his mother that went unanswered. He had done it not from suspicion in the dramatic sense, but from the physician's instinct for documentation. The same instinct that had made him keep the notebook, that had made him date every entry, that had made him understand, over 12 years of practice, that the dispute that destroys a good outcome is almost always the one that happened before anyone thought to write anything down. He had not been certain, at the time, what he was documenting. He had known that conversations were happening in his house that he was not part of. He had known that his wife Sandra had, over the previous months, developed a habit of making calls from rooms he was not in, of ending conversations when he entered, of a particular silence after the phone was put down that had the quality of something carefully resumed. He had known these things the way a diagnostician knows an abnormal presentation before the labs come back. Not proof, but pattern. He had put the recorder in his home office because his home office was where Sandra made the calls she did not make in front of him. He had done it quietly, as he did everything. He had labeled the first file with the date and put it in a folder on a drive he kept at the hospital, and had told himself he would listen when he had enough time to listen carefully. He had listened on a Sunday morning 3 weeks ago. He had sat in the hospital call room with headphones and had listened for 2 hours and 40 minutes. What he had heard had required him to sit very still for a long time afterward. Samuel had spent 12 years building a clinical and administrative career on the principle that the quality of an outcome is determined by the quality of the information you have before you make a decision. He had seen this proven and reproven across 1,000 patient cases. The diagnosis that was missed because someone moved to treatment before the imaging was back. The complication that was caught because a nurse had noted a 2-degree temperature change nobody else had flagged. He had organized his floor around documentation because documentation was the only record that survived the gap between what happened and what was later believed to have happened. He drove the Suburban because it was paid off, and he had not yet worn it out. He wore his grandmother's watch because she had given it to him, and because it kept correct time, and because a man who wears a thing given to him by someone who loved him carries that love on his wrist every day without needing to explain it to anyone. He had met Sandra 8 years ago through a mutual colleague. She worked in hospital administration at a different system, which had initially felt like the right kind of adjacent. They had married after 2 years. He had been happy in the early years of the marriage in the uncomplicated way of a man who has built something solid and expects it to continue to be so. The happiness had begun to show cracks 14 months before March. Not dramatic ones, not the kind a man notices all at once. The kind that appear in the way a building settles, slowly, in the mortar between old bricks, invisible until the pattern across multiple courses makes the progression undeniable. He had noticed the pattern 14 months ago and had told himself it was the weight of the work. He was department lead. His hours were long and irregular. He had told himself this explanation, which was possible, for 8 more months before he acknowledged that possible was not the same as actual, and that the evidence was pointing somewhere else. He had begun keeping closer notes at that point. He had kept them the way he kept clinical notes, dates, observations, the specific things said or not said, the pattern across time. He had not been looking for betrayal. He had been looking for clarity. In his experience, clarity arrived when you documented carefully enough. The recorder had been the next step in the documentation. The recordings had provided clarity. More than he had been prepared for. The recordings were of phone conversations Sandra had conducted in his home office over 12 separate sessions across 3 weeks. Not all of them were relevant. Some were professional calls, some were conversations with her own friends. But 7 of the recordings were calls to members of his family, his mother, his brother Marcus, his cousin Delia, his uncle Joseph, and twice, Aunt Rosie. What the recordings showed, listened to in sequence over 2 hours and 40 minutes in a hospital call room on a Sunday morning, was a systematic and patient campaign conducted over a period he estimated, from the references within the conversations, at approximately 18 months. The campaign had a consistent structure. Sandra would begin each conversation with genuine warmth and expressed concern. Concern for the family member. Concern for Samuel. Concern about things she was reluctant to share but felt she had to. The reluctance was performed with skill. She was not a dramatic person by nature, which made the performance more effective. It did not sound like complaint or accusation. It sounded like the careful, pained disclosure of a worried wife. What she disclosed, across 7 conversations with 5 members of his family, was a portrait of Samuel that bore no resemblance to the man he was. She described, to his mother, a husband who was emotionally absent and financially controlling, who gave Sandra a household allowance and required accounting for every purchase, who had never, in 8 years of marriage, once prioritized her needs above his professional obligations. She described to Marcus, a brother who was contemptuous of the family's values and who had said, privately, things about Marcus's legal situation 3 years ago that Marcus would find deeply hurtful. She described, to Aunt Rosie, a nephew who had never forgiven his aunt for a perceived slight at the wedding, who spoke of her with irritation, who included her in family obligations only out of obligation. None of it was true. Not a specific detail of it, not in tone, not in orientation. Samuel was a man who called his mother every Sunday, who had researched attorneys and driven his brother to the consultation, who had sat with his aunt and helped her read estate documents. The portrait Sandra had painted was constructed from the vocabulary of his actual life, his relationships, his history, his specific words repurposed out of all recognizable context, which was what made it so effective and so difficult to dispute from the outside. He had listened to all 7 recordings. He had listened to his mother's voice, careful and pained, saying that she worried about Sandra, that she had not realized, that perhaps she had been too demanding of Samuel's time. He had listened to Marcus say that he had wondered sometimes. He had listened to Aunt Rosie, who was 71 and had known him since he was born, say that she hoped Sandra was going to be all right. He had sat in the call room for a long time after the recordings ended. He was a physician. He had delivered difficult findings before. He had learned to let the findings be what they were without adding distortion from his own emotional response, because the distortion serves no one and the findings don't change. He let the findings be what they were. Then he made a list. The list had 2 columns. The left column was the people in his family he needed to reach, and in what order, and what he needed each of them to understand. The right column was the legal and practical steps that needed to happen in parallel. He had written the list in the notebook with the date in the margin. He had started with the right column because a physician always secures the condition before he addresses the cause. He had called Rosalind Akebe that same Sunday. Her name was Rosalind Akebe. She was 62. With an unhurried precision that reminded Samuel of the best attending physicians he had trained under, the ones who moved deliberately because they had already thought through what was coming. She had handled family law and asset litigation for 31 years. She had been referred to Samuel by a colleague in hospital administration who had used her in a dissolution 2 years prior and had described the experience in the spare language of someone who had been through something difficult and survived it. She's thorough. She doesn't miss things, and she tells you what you actually need to hear, not what you want to. Samuel had called her from the hospital parking structure on that Sunday, not the Sunday in April, the Sunday 3 weeks earlier, after the call room. She had answered at 7:30 p.m. and had not seemed surprised to receive a call at that hour. She had said, "Tell me the situation. Start from the beginning." He had told her everything, in order. The 14 months of pattern, the home office calls, the recorder, the 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had described the 7 calls in detail, the family members, the specific false representations, the period over which they had been made. She had been quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "You have recordings." He said, "Yes." She said, "Local or 2-party consent state?" He said, "1 party. I looked it up before I installed it." She said, "Good. How are the recordings stored?" He told her. A dedicated drive at the hospital, in his office, with a backup on an encrypted cloud service. He had already labeled and organized the 7 relevant files by date and family member. She said, "Come to my office Tuesday morning. Bring the drive." He said, "There are 2 things I want to address simultaneously: the dissolution and the family." She said, "I know, but the dissolution first. Everything else depends on the legal foundation being correct before you do anything with those recordings." She paused. "If you share the recordings with your family before we've assessed the full situation, we lose control of the information and possibly of the process. Can you wait until Tuesday?" He said, "Yes." He waited. He was a man who had learned to wait in the specific way of someone who has understood that premature action in a complex situation is always more expensive than patience. Tuesday's meeting with Rosalind lasted 2 hours. She listened to the relevant portions of 4 of the 7 recordings in her conference room. She did not listen expressionlessly. She listened the way a skilled attorney listens to evidence, with attention to the specific claims, the specific language, the probability of each false representation. She made notes throughout. When the last recording ended, she said, "These constitute defamation. Specific, documented false statements of fact made to third parties that have caused reputational and relational harm." She said it simply. In a dissolution context, they are also relevant to the question of the marital relationship's breakdown and to any claims she makes about the quality of the marriage. In a personal context, your family, they are the mechanism by which a wrong was done to you that can be corrected. She pulled out a fresh legal pad. She said, "Tell me about the assets, house, accounts, business interests, the whole picture." He told her. The house, joint title, purchased 6 years ago, equity of approximately $260,000, mortgage jointly held. 3 joint accounts, his own professional accounts, in his name alone, accumulated over 12 years of medical practice. A retirement account. His income was the primary household income. Sandra worked part-time in consulting. Rosalind made notes. She said, "The house is the primary marital asset. The professional accounts. Were any contributions made from marital income?" He said. "Some. My accountant has the breakdown." She said, "I want that breakdown. I want a forensic accountant to go through the full picture before we file. I use a woman named Vivienne. She's exceptional." She set her pen down. The dissolution itself is relatively straightforward on the financial side. What is not straightforward is the personal situation, the family. She looked at him. "I want you to listen to me carefully on this," he said. "I'm listening." She said, "The recordings are yours. They are legally obtained. They are devastating evidence of systematic deception. But how you use them with your family, and when, matters as much as the fact of them." She paused. "These are your mother, your brother, your aunt. They believed what they were told because they had no reason not to, and because it was told to them with patience and skill. They are not culpable. They are harmed. Just as you are harmed." She looked at him. "When you share these recordings with them, and you should, and you will, you are not showing them evidence of her wrongdoing. You are giving them the information they needed and didn't have. That is a different thing. The way you do it matters." He said, "I know." She said, "Tell me how you're thinking about it." He said, "My mother first. Then Marcus. Then Rosie. One at a time, in person. I want to be in the room when they hear it. I want to be there for whatever comes after." He had thought about this in the parking structure, in the left column of his list. "I don't want them to feel foolish. I want them to feel found." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. She said, "All right. File date pending the forensic review, the family conversations. Start them when you're ready. Don't wait for the filing." He said, "I'm ready now." He didn't move fast. He moved in sequence, the way a complex patient case moves, stabilize the condition, address the cause, rebuild the function. He drove to his mother's house on a Wednesday evening. He called ahead, which he had not done in 6 weeks, and which produced, in the 10-second pause before she said "of course," an unmistakable quality of relief that told him everything about what those 6 weeks had cost her too. He sat at her kitchen table across from her, and he set his phone on the table with the recordings cued. He said, "Mom, I need you to listen to something. Then I need you to listen to me." And I need you to know, before you hear it, that everything is going to be all right." She listened to the recording of her own call, 13 minutes, with her hands folded on the table in front of her and an expression that changed, slowly, through something that had no single name. When it ended, she did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Samuel," just his name. He said, "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. They sat there for a while. He answered her questions. He was patient, and he was complete. And he did not minimize what had been done, but he also did not amplify it beyond what it was, because amplification would not help his mother, and it would not help him, and it served no one. He was a physician. He delivered findings, and then he helped people understand what to do with them. He went to Marcus the following evening. He went to Aunt Rosie the evening after that. He went to his cousin Delia on Saturday morning. He went to his uncle Joseph on Sunday after church, where Joseph had, for the first time in months, been present and waiting for him at the door. By Sunday evening, the left column of his list was complete. The forensic accountant's review took 9 days. Vivienne found one significant item, a joint account that had been steadily drawn down over 7 months, with transfers to an external account in Sandra's name alone. Total transferred, $31,000. The account had been opened 11 months ago. Rosalind incorporated the dissipation claim into the filing. The dissolution petition was filed on a Monday morning. It was thorough and complete. The dissipation claim of $31,000. The marital home equity division, with a small separate property credit for a pre-marital contribution Samuel had documented with his accountant. The retirement account division, per the forensic breakdown. A motion for the court to consider the recorded conduct as relevant to the dissolution's factual record, not as punitive argument, but as documented context for the state of the marriage. Sandra was served on a Wednesday. Her attorney called Rosalind the following afternoon. The attorney, a woman named Home, who had a reputation for aggressive positioning in initial communications, was notably less aggressive than her reputation in this particular call. Rosalind reported that the attorney had been briefed on the recordings. The attorney had asked whether they would be filed publicly. Rosalind had said they had been incorporated into the court record. The settlement proposal came in 3 weeks. It addressed the finances, the home, the accounts, the dissipation claim, with a directness that Rosalind described as unusual for a first proposal. The financial terms were close to what the petition had sought. The only significant departure was on spousal support, where Sandra's attorney requested 18 months. Rosalind countered with 6 months, given the length of the marriage and Sandra's employment history. They settled at 9. The dissolution was final 5 months after the petition. Samuel did not attend the final signing. Rosalind handled it. He was in the hospital. He answered every call the same day. He kept the notebook. His mother called him on a Tuesday morning in June, not a Sunday, a Tuesday, at 8:15, because she had something she wanted to say and she had not wanted to wait until Sunday. She said, "I want to tell you something." He was walking the hospital corridor between rounds. He stepped into an alcove by the window. She said, "I believed her because she sounded like someone who was worried about you." And I thought, a woman who is worried about her husband must love him. I didn't understand that worry can be performed. She paused. "I want you to know that I know what kind of man you are. I have always known. I should not have let a performance confuse me about what I already knew." He stood in the alcove for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did on a Tuesday morning in June. He said, "Mom, you didn't do anything wrong. You heard something that was designed to sound true. from someone in a position you trusted. That's not a failure of judgment. That's what happens when someone works very hard to deceive you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're very even about this." He said, "I've had practice." She laughed. It was a real laugh, his mother's laugh, the one he had known since before he could name it. He said, "I'll see you Sunday." She said, "Come early. I'm making jollof." He said, "I'll be there at noon." He went back to rounds. In the fall following the dissolution, Mercy General promoted Samuel to Associate Chief of Medicine, a hospital-wide administrative and clinical role that worked alongside the existing chief on strategic development and departmental oversight. He had been approached about the position before and had declined, because the timing had not been right. The timing was right now. He hired a replacement department lead for the hospitalist floor, his most senior attending, who had been ready for 2 years and whom Samuel had been preparing specifically for the transition without announcing that was what he was doing. He told her at a Wednesday morning meeting in his office, the city visible through the window, 2 cups of coffee on the desk. She said she had been waiting for this. He said, "I know. So had I." He answered every call the same day. He kept his grandmother's watch wound. He called his mother every Sunday. She answered on the first ring. On a Sunday evening in late October, Samuel Okafor sat in the Suburban in the driveway of his mother's house after dinner. Jollof in conversation, and his uncle Joseph telling the same story about a fishing trip he had told 17 times, which remained, the 17th time as the first, genuinely funny. He sat in the driveway for a moment before starting the engine. Because the evening was the kind of evening worth sitting in, the air had changed over into real autumn. The street was quiet. The lights were on in his mother's front room, and through the window he could see her moving in the kitchen, unhurried, the ordinary motion of a woman in her own home at the end of a Sunday. He thought about the 2 hours and 40 minutes in the call room. He thought about what he had heard and what he had sat with afterward, and the list in 2 columns, and the 12 conversations he had needed to have, one at a time, to rebuild what had been pulled apart over 18 months. He thought about how long it had taken, not the legal part, not the dissolution, but the other part, the one that had no official process, the one that required him to sit across a kitchen table from each person he loved and give them the information they had been denied, and then sit with them while they processed it. That part had taken 6 evenings and 1 Sunday morning, and all of his patience and all of his care. He thought about the recordings. He thought about the fraying cable in the cup holder, which he had finally replaced, which had taken him 3 months to get around to, and which had been a $5 fix when he finally made it. He thought about what it cost to let things go unaddressed, and what it cost to address them. He thought about his mother answering on the first ring. He started the engine. He drove home. He went inside and turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.